My name's Ashley Tuck, and I work for Wessex Archaeology mainly as a report writer. I'm based in Wessex Archaeology's large office in Sheffield. This is the office behind me. And you might have seen me. I did the Sheffield Castle dig, and sometimes I speak as an expert on industrial archaeology. So that's a little bit about me. Yeah, we've been working on the Outseas project for 9 years. It's quite a long time. And this webinar has been timed to coincide with the publication of the results in the Derbyshire Archaeological Journal. That's not quite been released yet, so this webinar is a preview of the results. And the project's been a real team effort. This photo shows my colleague Emma Carter instructing a machine driver on the excavation of a trial trench. Other phases of excavation were undertaken by Neil Dransfield, Stuart Pearson, Jonathan Pottery and Hannah Dabble. Emma and Stu have done webinars recently, so you might be familiar with them. They might be familiar faces to you. So the site is in Derbyshire. You can see on the left there, there's Derbyshire, somewhere in England, in the middle of England, and the site marked with the red dot. And on the right hand there, you can see where it is in relation to the town of Alfreton. Alfreton's a town in Derbyshire, over there on the east, away from the Peak District, but it's still very pleasant. And you can see the train station in Alfreton is marked there with that circular dot, and the site is just to the south of that. And here we've got an extract from a map. I realise there's a lot to take in here, so don't think you've got to unravel all of the details of the map as we're talking here. If you do want to study this in greater detail, there's a better version of it in the publication, so I'd recommend you have a look at that later. Some of the important things here are the lane at the top there is the modern Carnfield lane, which leads up to the train station that we just saw, and the modern A38 passes along about where the bottom of the map is. So if you know Alfreton at all, maybe that will help you sort of understand where we are. We've digitized this map based on an enclosure map from 1812, and I've cross-referenced that with the poor rate of assessment of 1824, and the data, and there's a decades discrepancy between those two sets of data, but it lined up almost perfectly. And yeah, the lane at the top there, Carnfield Lane, leads east to Carnfield Hall, which is in the neighbouring parish of South Normanton. Yes, so it's great to see the character of some of these field names. What have we got? There's Orchard Field, Ox Pastures, Simpson's Pringle, Crowwood. These are really evocative names. I can imagine somebody being told, oh, go down Crowwood and do whatever job needs doing, this time of year. It really sort of links me with the farmers that would have worked on this land. I can imagine their day-to-day life. Yeah, so the different hatching on this plan represents different landowners. The sort of cross hatching in the middle there, marked with an X, that's where the modern Flowery Lees School is. So if you know that school at all, it's now been built on that plot of land. And these diagonal hatchings up here represent land that was owned directly by tenants of Outseas Farm. And this area was developed for housing in the mid-20th century. And then this area here, the horizontal hatching, this is the location of the site. This is the area I'm going to be talking about today. And this was the tenancy of Outseas Farm. So they rented these fields and the farmhouse, which is marked by the red X there, from a landlord. Okay, so this is a picture of my mentor, Neil Dransfield. He no longer works in archaeology, but there he is. If you'll indulge me, he's turned up to site on the first day with these beautiful horses, and he went out to put some trial trenches targeting some really quite promising geophysical anomalies, and they dug the trenches and they found absolutely nothing. So thanks for coming to the talk. That's the end, but it's not really. thankfully, we were able to go back and study other parts of the site. And the reason that we're able to do this archaeological work is due to the planning process. The county archaeologists Sarah White and Steve Baker were very good on this job. And the developer, who was the Wealden Group, was very cooperative. So it's thanks to that process that there were further opportunities to investigate the archaeology of the site. So Stuart Pearson, you might remember Stuart. He's been doing the excavations at Coles Hill Manor with the big octagonal Elizabethan moat. Some great work that's been going on there. He went out to Outseats and did a second round of trial trenching, and he found only these 4 scratty little features. And we weren't very impressed with these. We didn't think there was anything very significant going on. It's just some pictures in a gully. We weren't thrilled, but we did our due diligence and we recorded them. And the team shoveled some of the fills of these features, the mud that's in these archaeological features, into buckets, and we brought them back to our office to study them. And it's a very good job that we did that, because the environmental material that we got out of those samples was actually pretty exciting. There were the charred remains of a wheat grain, bits of hazelnut shell, and wild plant seeds, including corn salad and hemlock, as well as the tubers of onioncooch. Corn salad and hemlock were both introduced to Britain during the Bronze Age, probably as cereal weeds, which gives us a very broad kind of date. These features were dug sometime between the Bronze Age and now, which is, most of history and there's all of history and a good chunk of prehistory. So not really that useful, but it at least gave us some kind of a lead. And the cereal weeds as well, so it's possible, especially tied in with that wheat grain, that there's some kind of farming in the general vicinity. So the environmental assemblage potentially filled a gap in our knowledge that had been previously identified by the regional research agenda. There's a document called the East Midlands Research Strategy, which is a really useful document. Outlines areas that are worthwhile for archaeological study across the region. And we thought that these environmental samples potentially had the ability to fill in some of the gaps in our knowledge. So we did some radiocarbon dating. You might be familiar with that. It's where you look at the isotopes of carbon. We can tell from the half-life how old the sample is. So on this chart we've got here, this figure, the 3 plots in the middle there are the results of the 3 radiocarbon dates that we submitted on the onioncooch tubers, and the top and bottom ones are just mathematical models, so you don't need to worry about those right now. But you can see the 3 middle ones are really consistent. They're the same thing, aren't they? There's no real variation there. So really strong result. We can look down to the bottom of the graph, and we can see that the samples are from the first couple of centuries BC. So it's from the Iron Age. So that's pretty interesting. And I do have to caveat this, because we also did radiocarbon on the wheat grain. We only had 1 wheat grain, and that turned out to be a few centuries younger. It was actually a Roman wheat grain that had become mixed in with the Iron Age onioncooch tubers. So there's some level of mixing in these deposits, and they're not entirely secure. So just a word of caution on that one. So what is onioncooch? It's a perennial grass that has nothing to do with onions. It's not. We haven't found ancient onions. It's a type of grass that's looks a bit like onion. I'll show you the part that looks like an onion in a minute. And the culm nodes of one subspecies of this grass develop into tubers. You can see them there. My father took this photo when I told him that I was doing this talk, so thank you very much for that contribution. you can see it looks a little bit like an onion. It's kind of onion, isn't it? A little bit, maybe. And the reason for its charred presence in archaeological deposits is open to interpretation. We've listed a load of authors in the publication, and they've come up with various different interpretations depending on where they had found these tubers. One person said that maybe they've been used as fuel. Well, that doesn't sort of, you know, they're quite small and hard to collect. Maybe doesn't ring true. Somebody else has said that they had been used as a funerary bed. So, you know, human remains have been placed on top of onioncooch, which is you know, a suitable interpretation for maybe that particular site. But we're not dealing with a funerary environment here at Outseats, as far as we know. And somebody else has said that maybe they were just accidentally burnt. And of course, that's perfectly reasonable. It's entirely possible that this was just some accidental burning. But the thing I'm really excited about is the possibility that these could have been used as food. Could you have eaten these? And they don't look entirely unappetizing at first sight. So it seems to be reasonable. We've listed 6 authors in the publication that have previously suggested that they could be used as food. Now, I'm a keen forager, and I thought I'd go and look in Raymier's, have a look in Raymier's book, and he says that they're inedible, which doesn't mean they're poisonous, it just means that you can't, they're not nice to eat, and that they're of little calorific value. So he suggests that possibly not worth collecting because you don't really get anything out of them. Well, during the first lockdown, I found myself digging out a ditch, and I happened to be, nothing to do with archaeology, it was just digging out a ditch that had become filled in, and I happened to be digging through lots of onioncooch. And I was thinking back, what do I know about onioncooch? Well, we found some at Outseats, so I picked up some of the bulbs, I cleaned them off, you know, I rubbed them on my sleeve, and maybe should stress that Wessex didn't pay me to do this or ask me to do it. It's just something that seemed appropriate at the time. And I got the tuber and I bit into it to see, you know, what kind of experience that would be. And they were absolutely disgusting. They were tough and woody and astringent and really unpleasant. And I can't see that anybody would eat these raw. I've got another image there of onioncooch, and the important thing about it, this is probably a better, you can see that it does look a bit like an onion, these tiny tubers. And the important thing here is over on the left there, that bulb has been nibbled by a mouse or some other kind of rodent. So it's at least got some attractiveness to mice. Mice aren't people, so you know, it's an observation of limited value, but at least something's been eating it. And I was discussing this with our environmental specialist, Ines Lopez-Driga. She's also a keen forager, and we were discussing whether roasting the tubers might improve things. So I got some more of the tubers out of the ditch that I'd been digging, and I cleaned them off and put them in the bottom oven, and I left them overnight and forgot all about them. And I came back in the morning, and they were much improved. They weren't perfect, they were a bit burnt, but the woodiness had disappeared. The tannins in the tubers had been destroyed. Tannins are a chemical that are in tea and red wine, and they make things taste woody. The bulbs were still a bit astringent, you know, they were quite dry, but it wasn't entirely unpleasant. It was just a flavour they had. But the really important thing was that they've become pleasantly caramelised. They were almost a bit like sweets, and I think it's possible that people may have chosen to eat these for that reason, for a cultural, they might have had cultural value, independent of their nutritional content, perhaps. So that ties in with the Edible England theme of the Heritage Open Days. So that's the result we've got. That's the best I can say about the onioncooch. Just go on to the next slide. So yes, we got into the real meat of the site as construction moves south, revealing a series of medieval enclosures. You can see my colleague there, is that Michael Keach, I think? He's shoveling away as that digger's stripping the topsoil and the subsoil away from the field to reveal the archaeological features. You can just about see one in the bottom of that photo there. There's a band of dark material running through, and we've highlighted it on either side with a bit of yellow spray paint. You might be able to see that if your screen's good. Or here on the right is a better example of one of these ditches. There's Keach again. He's walking off. He's fed up. He's going off for lunch. Enough of this digging. We've done enough for now. And you can see here some of the methods that we use to excavate and record. We put in a series of holes. There's one down the bottom there, another one up here. Next to that white hard hat. We set up a string and a tape, and somebody's drawn the sides of that intervention. And we've got a clipboard there that we're making notes on, filling in context sheets so that we've got all the details of the deposits that we've dug through. Nowadays, we do a lot of that with tablets, like an iPad, but not iPads, which has improved things a lot. It's a lot easier doing it digitally, but back when we did this, we were still using paper. Back in the ancient days of 2017. Yeah. So yes, we've got a series of medieval enclosures, and you can see a plan of them on the left, a working shot there on the right. And the earliest of these enclosures was enclosure 4, which I've highlighted there in red. You can see on the right there is one of the slots that we dug through the enclosure ditch. The enclosures are defined by ditches all around, and the black stuff there in the bottom of that hole that we dug, that's actually coal. There's natural coal outcropping on the side, so it's not, you couldn't pick it up and burn it. It's just mixed in with the clay, but that's what that dark stuff is. And enclosure 4 was incorporated into a more regular, better planned series of rectilinear enclosures. Enclosure 4 continued to be maintained after the other enclosures were established, so it's not been replaced by them, it's just been maintained whilst those other enclosures were in use. And we know that because the ditches were recut a couple of times in some cases. And we can see the sequence of ditch fills and the way they stack up. So we know that enclosure 4 was the oldest, and then the other 3 enclosures were dug, but enclosure 4 continued to be used. And over on the right, we've got a photo of a very clean ditch section cut through that stony clay natural. You can see the very typical fill, that kind of greyish brownish material that's come to fill the ditch. And the enclosures had a drain that drained away to the northeast down the hill. So water management was built into this system of enclosures. And on the right, you can see the section through that drain. And this is a very interesting part that I've highlighted there in red. What I think is that the enclosures were used to corral stock. So animals were penned inside these enclosures. I reckon, that's my opinion. And one of the reasons I think this is because of these features that I've highlighted in red. I think this is a route or the end of a droveway approaching an entrance into enclosure 2. At the bottom there, it's the entranceway, if you can see my mouse. And so I think maybe animals were led down this path into the enclosure there. One of the interesting things about the entranceway, which we've got a photo of on the right. Now, I appreciate that I'm asking you to see light brown fills against yellow brown natural. It's not the easiest thing to pick out, but at the top there, in this area, if you can see my mouse, that was the original end of the ditch at the entranceway, and then that's become filled in. And when they've recut it, they've cut it shorter, just at the top of that furthest scale there is the end of the shorter recut. So they've started off with a very impractical opening, and then when they've remade it, they've widened the entrance, so it's easier to get in and out. What have we got next? Oh yes, this ditch section is pretty interesting because the colours they kind of look all wrong. You see this in archaeology and you think, what's going on here? It's not very intuitive, but it's perfectly understandable. The yellow stuff in the bottom is the natural, like you'd expect. That's perfectly normal. This kind of grey-brown fill is very typical fill, and the confusing thing is all this dark stuff around the top. And I might have given the game away earlier. You probably guessed that's natural coal. So there's a very dark natural layer there that the ditch has been dug through in places. So that's interesting if any of you have ever perhaps volunteered on a site or done the commercial archaeology or any other kind of archaeology. And we've got a series of pits. We've got these very wide, shallow pits down in the southwest, sorry. This end of the enclosures was the worst preserved as it was upslope and had been impacted by ploughing. When people had come along in later centuries and ploughed the fields, it had gone deeper at the top where the soil was a bit thinner. And in this area we had these enigmatic pits. I don't know what they were for. Somebody suggested they were quarry pits, but you know, there's more stone in the fill than there was in the clay natural surrounding it. It doesn't look like they're really quarrying anything to me. One of the pits contained a quantity of iron smelting slag, which initially suggested that these may be furnaces. Again, there's no evidence of heat transformation, and the shape of the pits isn't consistent with furnaces. There's no furnace lining, or there's nothing here to suggest these are actual furnaces. The raw materials for iron smelting are available locally. There's coal and iron ore. Smelting was probably practiced in the wider landscape, but I think this slag has just been disposed of into one of these pits. They've just had some waste material kicking around, and there's a hole in the ground, chuck it in there. That kind of approach. And there's also some smaller pits in Enclosure 1. These are a bit more regular. Again, they're very shallow. Could all of the pits have been dew ponds for watering stock, maybe? To collect a bit of rainwater or something, perhaps. So the ditch fills contained medieval pottery, which was made during the 13th and 14th centuries. The pot has been studied by Chris Cumberpatch, and you can read his full report in the publication. One of the interesting things we know is that the pottery had been deposited somewhere else. The pottery was very abraded, and it had been laid down in a waste heap or a midden, and then that material had been incorporated into the ditch fills. So you can see there's some illustrations here of a range of pieces of pottery that we recovered. Interestingly, there were also 2 fragments of Roman tile that might have been reused or discarded in the medieval period. What have we got? Oh yes, so I've circled a spindle wall there. A spindle wall is like a weight that you attach onto a piece of thread when you're spinning with it, when you're trying to spin the thread. And we were all quite confused about this particular object because it was really light. It didn't have any mass. It didn't have any density. And we couldn't understand how it had been used for spinning. So Chris Cumberpatch solved the problem. I was delighted when I heard the solution. The particular type of pottery that this object was made out of, it's been made out of a waste piece of pottery that's been made into a circle and had a hole perforated through it. So someone's broken some kind of pot or some, whatever it is they've broken, and they've reused the waste material to make the spindle wall. And the original pottery had been tempered with shell inclusions, and all of this shell had been leached out of the pottery. It had washed away, and that was why the object was so light, because all of the weight of the sherd had been leached out. So that was a fairly interesting object. And then near to the enclosures was this stone-built kiln. There was a flue in the left of the photograph that would have carried heat into the chamber on the right there. And we got some environmental samples from this, some charred plant remains, which were mostly grains, cereal grains. And we did radiocarbon dating on those cereal grains, and that revealed that the kiln was from the 13th or 14th centuries. So it's contemporary with the enclosures. So here we've got arable farming. They're making grain and they're processing it. And in the enclosures, we've got evidence that they're keeping animals. So they've got a mixed agricultural economy. And the grains that we got out of the kiln were a mixture of barley and oats, which resembles a mixture called dredge that is used during malting. So malting is a process where grains are sprouted in moist air to be used for brewing and for other purposes. So some of the grains have germinated, and initially we thought, oh yeah, we've got a malting kiln, brilliant. And this could be a malting kiln, we can't rule that out. But when we studied the grains in a bit more detail, we found that their coleoptile hollows, one of the features of the grain, were all different. And that indicates that the grains had not been sprouted at the same time. They'd not all been malted together. So the evidence is therefore inconclusive, and this might not be a malting kiln. It might just be a simple crop dryer. And crop dryers are fairly common, and were used to dry grain to prevent spoilage. So harvest your grain, it's a bit wet, dry it out in a crop dryer. We also studied the wood charcoal that was obtained from the kiln. The fuel that had been used to heat the kiln, and we discovered that the wood had been obtained from a variety of different circumstances in the landscape. And one of those was coppicing. Nearby, there'd been coppicing wood to use for fuel, but they'd also got wood from other pathways in the landscape. Okay, so that's about it for the medieval remains. As well as the medieval and prehistoric remains, we had a chance to study the footprint of the recently demolished farm at Outseats Farm itself. There was no evidence for medieval or earlier activity in the location of the farm complex, and this well in the photograph was the oldest feature from the farm complex. So the lower fills contained the lower material inside of the well contained 16th and 17th century pottery, and the upper fills contained 18th century pottery. So that's a nice sequence. And the contents of environmental samples from the well were not substantially different to the medieval samples, so that suggests that there was a continuity in land use and agricultural practice from the medieval period into these centuries. And it's a nice well. It's very aesthetically pleasing. I like the stone lining there and the rich fill. So that's a nice thing to dig up. Oops, we've gone back for some reason. Let's go forwards instead. Here's a plan of the below ground layout of the farm complex of Outseats Farm. Where are we at? This building here that I've highlighted in red, that's the farmhouse. We know from historic maps that that was present from at least 1812. One of the wall foundations contained thin bricks consistent with an 18th century date, so it's possible that the farmhouse dates from a bit earlier than its first appearance on historic maps. And here's a photo of, this is that northeastern, forgive me, room of the farmhouse, and it was sort of like a cellar room. It's at a lower level than the ground floor, the rest of the building. And you can see that it's got these brick sort of structures for holding up benches or other things. So maybe this was a storeroom or a larder, that kind of a space. And this wall here that I've highlighted in red, This is quite evocative for me because we know from historic maps that this is the wall separating the cottage garden from the lane. So the garden of the farmhouse was to the north of that red line, and the lane, Flowery Lees Lane, leading up to the farm was to the south of it. So I can imagine, you know, a family on a nice summer's day walking up the lane to the farmhouse. So just you know, a moment of connection with the with what we find. We spend so much time looking at the nuts and bolts of deposits and bricks. You know, the physical remains of archaeology. It's nice when you get something that can sort of remind you of the people, perhaps. Yeah, and the other buildings here are probably barns, a variety of different barns used for different functions. Some of them had stalls in them, some of them might be used for storing equipment. You know, there's various different barns you can get on a farm. And these two that I've highlighted here were remodeled as one big barn like that. We know that from a combination of the archaeological results and looking at historic maps. And the reason they might have done that is to widen access to the farmyard at the end of the lane. That's potentially one reason. And we know we've got a palimpsest. We've got a sequence of different buildings of different ages making up the farmyard, the farm complex. How are we doing for time? 11:37. Okay. So that's about it, really. It was quite hard to write a title for this talk, as the results consist of a variety of different threads. There's the Iron Age plant remains, the medieval enclosures and the kiln, and then the more recent farm complex. Trying to find a theme to link these. There's food, obviously, that ties in with the Heritage Open Days theme. The later agricultural remains clearly fit with that pattern. And the onioncooch tubers, if they were used as food, they fit as well. But even if they weren't, then the presence of cereal weeds and the Roman wheat grain still speak of agricultural activity in the more distant past. So there's a theme of food production. And the other thread that I think links these remains is a sense of being outside of a focus of activity that's hovering somewhere beyond the limits of the site. The name Outseats itself means exactly this. Outseats is a satellite place outside of somewhere. Carnfield Hall, which may be the site of an earlier manor, is only a few hundred metres away to the northeast, but it's in another parish. And historic research by the editor of the Derbyshire Archaeological Journal that's in the publication suggests that the Outseats land only became associated with the hall at a late date. So it's probably better to think of Outseats as a satellite Alfreton of the town rather than being associated with the hall in South Normanton parish. So here in the Iron Age, humans were doing something that included the charring of onioncooch and weed seeds. There wasn't a settlement necessarily. We can't say it's a ritual site. We can't really say it's anything in particular. But people were here in the space outside of another location doing something. And in the medieval period, the animal enclosures and grain kiln attest to mixed farming, but there's no evidence of their houses, or we don't have the kind of settlement evidence that these agricultural features are relevant to. And then in more recent centuries, the farmstead was developed, and again, that's outside of the centre of Alfreton. It's a satellite of the town, and even that hasn't been enough to secure this place, this place of Outseats, from the encroachment of the town. And you can see that in this photo. I picked this image with the rainbow to sum up on because it's a beautiful photo, and the double rainbow there, and the people digging away in the excavation and the lighting, But the thing that I see here as I was writing my conclusions is that the town of Alfreton is just approaching, isn't it? It's just peering over the hill. It's just about to come and engulf this space. So that kind of, even on this last image, that ties in with that theme that this place is somehow beyond, it's outsides. Yeah, so publication in the Derbyshire Archaeological Journal is imminent. If you want to see more, please go and look into that. And thank you all for listening.